Having been a police officer for almost 30 years, I have seen my fair share of dark things in my time, and I have to say that the majority of them have been things that human beings do to one another, whether it's for money, for love, or because of some emotion that overtakes them in the moment. Humanity most definitely has its dark side. Still, I have to say that even after all these years, seeing people lie and scheme and hurt each other, it is other dark things, the ones that I can't blame on people or their motives, that scare me the most. The things I've seen that make me believe that whilst humans may have their dark side, there are things far darker, still waiting in the shadows. One example of this, the one that haunts me to this day, was the case my friends refer to as the Tinder, or more often Sweet Tooth murders. The sweet part of this nickname comes from my report, a report that many people read but almost no one believed, in which I referred to the chief suspect Lilith Waite as an e-dating honey trap. The tooth part was also from my report, and a sort of sick joke, relating to what I claimed to have seen, what I still claim to have seen, and what, in an attempt to avoid using the word vampire, I instead referred to teeth in the night. I suppose it doesn't matter what stupid name you give it. The result is still the same. Those men are still dead and Lilith is still out there, somewhere. Now, before we start, let me say for the record that up until that night, I never believed in such a thing as a vampire. I certainly did not think that Lilith Waite was one. Crazy? Probably. A murderer? Most likely, but a vampire? If you'd said that to me at the time, I'd have laughed in your face. But I'm not laughing now. In the years since I filed that report, my colleagues have pointed out over and over to me that Lilith couldn't have been what I suspected her to be, especially because on her profile, she was photographed walking around in broad daylight. "What kind of vampire goes out in the sunlight, huh?" they'd say mockingly. For a while I would reply by telling them that in the novel, Dracula walks around in the sunlight too, but since most of them have never opened, let alone read a book cover to cover, I figured I was wasting my breath. All I can tell you is that I saw what I saw and I filed an honest report. What you chose to believe is up to you. So here goes. I first became interested in Lilith Waite in the summer of 2016. That she was allowed to get away with what she did for so long is basically a story of miscommunication and police incompetence. Over the course of the previous 3 years, 12 young men from our city had disappeared virtually without a trace, which obviously, at a rate of 1 every 3 months, should have been a big news story. Problem was, unbelievable as it might sound, nobody noticed. This is because the cases were not initially classed as murders. They were dealt with by 12 different investigators who did not mention their findings to one another. In cases where there was no physical evidence to suggest foul play, the disappearances were just chalked up as missing person reports. It was only in late 2015, when one of the cases landed on my desk, that any connection was drawn between them. Reading the file on my case, the disappearance of a guy named Michael Edwards, I noted that he had been in frequent communication through an e-dating site with an attractive, single young woman named Lilith. What's more, having been let into his apartment by his sister using her spare key, I found his laptop, still open and unlocked with the dating app still up, showing his interactions with this woman and the fact that he had arranged to meet with her on the night he disappeared. Obviously, my first step was to try to contact this Lilith to find out what she knew about Michael's disappearance, but I got no response, and the e-dating company refused to release her personal details until I had a court order, because otherwise, it would be a breach of confidentiality. So, instead, I decided to visit the spot where Lilith and Michael had agreed to meet. The Point, a children's playground, seemed to me a strange place for a first meeting, but reading through the pair's messages to each other, it became clear that they had both expressed some nostalgia about having played at this park as kids, and surprised that they never bumped into each other back then. The playground St. Luke's Park, named after the church that sits at the end of the nearest block, is fairly central. Close to the woodland that fringes the area and around 5 minutes from most of the local stores, it had served kids in that neighborhood for decades. It's pretty safe to say, therefore, that most guys from the area would know where it was, and remember at one time or another having swung on the swings or ridden on the creaky old merry-go-round, either as a younger kid or hanging out with friends as an adolescent on a Friday night before they were old enough to get into bars. Lilith, having shared her memories of going to this park as a teenager with friends, then suggested the crazy idea that maybe they should meet there for their first in-person date. "It'd be cute," she had written. "Go back to where we should have met as kids." make up for the lost time. You could bring some food and a bottle of wine, or play on the merry-go-round, and well, maybe later you could take me for a ride." Michael had agreed, and following in his footsteps I had visited the same area. At first I found nothing. Some litter, the remnants of a half-eaten pizza and a plastic bag containing dog poop that some owner had decided not to take home with them. Close to the tree line, however, I found something else. A finger nestled at the base of a bush and sticking out slightly from the long grass. I remember feeling a mix of excitement at having found a clue and sorrow for what this probably meant for Michael and the news I would need to break to his sister. Having submitted the finger into evidence, I decided to search up the name Lilith and the park location on the police database to see if anything else came up. It was at this point that I discovered the other 11 cases. 11 men, all from our city who, according to friends, family or phone records, had been in contact with someone named Lilith in the weeks before they vanished. In 4 of the 11 cases, the specific park where Michael was last seen was mentioned by friends or in messages they had sent. Having found this link, I asked the e-dating company to provide me with records of everyone Lilith had interacted with in the past 3 years. They again said that this was private information and that I would need a court order, which I had already filed the paperwork for. They also said that even with the order, the records would take at least 2 weeks to be made available. Frustrated by the company's reluctance to cooperate, I threatened them with legal action and told them that at the very least I needed them to suspend Lilith's account until further notice. This they did. Unfortunately, whilst they worried a great deal about the security and privacy of their clients' information, they did not worry much about mine, and when Lilith queried why her account had been suspended, they told her the truth. She was being investigated by the police who had requested her records. This one act of monumental stupidity meant that Lilith simply closed her account and with a 2-week head start before we would have records or her address, promptly disappeared. In the meantime, I decided to follow a different lead and asked the groundskeeper at St. Luke's whether the CCTV cameras they had positioned on the sides of the buildings would pick up anything from the playground itself. At first, he seemed reluctant to answer, as if I was accusing him of something, but eventually, he nodded, saying that because of the distance, it would be difficult to make out faces or details, but that yes, the footage would show the park. I told him not to worry about the footage and asked to take it with me. An hour later, I passed it on to the forensics department so my buddy Mal could work his enhancement magic on it by enlarging and cleaning up the footage for the night in question. Thinking even now about what we saw on screen makes my blood run cold. At first, the pixelated wash of inky blacks and pale blues showed nothing but the dirt path leading to the playground. After several minutes, however, a man, whom I immediately recognized as Michael, appeared on screen and began walking toward the merry-go-round. He was carrying a rucksack, which I assumed contained the wine and snacks suggested by Lilith. For a while, Michael was alone, kicking up the dirt with the toe of his sneaker and repeatedly checking his watch. But around 10 minutes later, a young woman appeared. She was short, attractive, and sported long, dreadlocked hair. She moved slowly into the playground, and the two embraced and began to talk. Though there was no sound on the recording, it was clear that the two were deep in conversation. Even then, though, there was something that felt odd about the interaction, about the isolation of it and the way that Lilith seemed constantly to be looking away or past Michael, as if expecting someone else to show up. It was around 5 minutes later that something entirely unexpected actually occurred. As a child, I remember watching our science teacher give a lesson to explain magnetism. In it, he placed a small circle of metal staples onto a sheet of paper, then held the end of a magnet, unseen below it in the center of this metal ring. I remember the gasps as the staples, as if by magic, all rushed at once in unison toward the center of the circle, like a pack of wolves descending upon their prey. I mention this because as I watched the footage that night, that's what the shadows did. As Mal and I watched, dumbfounded, the dark areas that had formed the lines of the trees, the edges of the pathway, and the shadows behind the swings, formed and pooled into human shapes. So dark they seemed to have been cut out of the scene. Where once there was the line of a shadow, now there was a taloned hand. Where there was once the shadow of a bush, a head, with stretching, gaping jaws full of teeth. For an instant, these strange darkened forms, solid shadows in a circle around the pair, seemed to pause. But then, like the staples to a magnet, they rushed, as one, toward the center, flooding inward to where Michael was sitting, until, in less than a moment, he disappeared beneath the swarm of black. Lilith, meanwhile, simply watched as the dark things, her brethren or perhaps her offspring, tore and wrenched and fed. Then, she casually rose to her feet, turned, and strolled away, disappearing from sight, from the footage, and out from our grasp. I did not use the word vampire in my report, because I'm not sure that's what these things, the things that Lilith had lured and tempted her dates toward and eventually fed them to, actually were. What I do know is that about a week after I submitted my report, both the footage and the remains I had discovered at the scene mysteriously vanished from evidence. They have still never been found. Lilith Waite, whom I believe to this day had some hand in the disappearance of 12 men in my city, has never been arrested, interviewed, or even brought into police custody. When the e-dating company finally did release the data, it confirmed that she matched and texted with every young man on my list, arranging to see them often on the very night that they vanished forever. Her whereabouts are currently unknown, and though we have tried on many occasions to search dating sites and have even used the usual facial recognition software, we have been unable to locate her. For all we know, there could be a young man chatting to her right now, agreeing to meet at some isolated place, hoping to get lucky and completely unaware that his luck is about to run out.